Welcome to Troy Historical Society's monthly evening program. And you'll note that we're not in the museum like we normally are, because this event is, well, we had it last year and there was people turned away because it was too crowded. So it looks like a good crowd here tonight. We even have a balcony filled up here. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our program tonight, The Return of Sasquatch to Troy. And our speaker is Dr. Simon Hines, and he's a doctorate graduate in Moscow, or WSU.
WSU.
He did take some classes in Moscow, but that doesn't mean that he's anything less of authority. Anyway, with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hines.
Thanks a lot, David. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I'm not going to use the mic unless you really need it. Well, thanks for inviting me back, David. I really enjoyed the talk exactly a year ago. It was March 20th. To the day, and it's great to be back again. And if you were here last year, I have some new material because we're always learning new things. I have to say, learning about the reality of Sasquatch and Bigfoot was one of the biggest surprises of my life. I mean, I'm originally from New York City. We don't have a lot of Sasquatch in New York City. In fact, I've looked it up. There are occasional sightings here and there, Long Island, kind of around there, but it isn't something that people generally talk about growing up there. But having gone to the University of Arizona, Tucson, to get my master's degree, and then coming out to WSU in the late 80s, this sort of topic began to slowly sink into my awareness, as I'm about to show you. But before I begin, I mean, has anyone here how many people have had Sasquatch sightings themselves? I know some of you have, because you have, John, okay. We talked last year, and some of you are back again, and how about during the Q&A, you can share your experiences, okay? Great. So, I want to show you how I got involved with this topic. I think it's a fascinating and important topic because, you know, the way we grow up in society, the school systems we go to, the institutions we're part of, the organizations we belong to, always sort of emphasize what we know and always kind of keep going overboard in confidence on the known world. But there's so much that we don't know, and institutions generally don't like to admit how much they don't know. And what this topic shows us is there is a lot we don't know, even about our own planet and who is here with us, as I'm about to show you. So for me, this began at WSU. I got to WSU in 1987, and I learned in sociology as a graduate student a lot about mathematical modeling, sort of what I specialized in, research methods, and it always seemed to me that social sciences were overly oriented towards very linear, direct causal explanations of reality that didn't always fit what we see around us. We often use something called the normal distribution, you know, the bell curve. It's sometimes called the Gaussian distribution. And it's kind of this normalizing sort of statistical distribution that is based on averages and means and standard deviations. When I went to the Ag Econ department to take the real mathematically based statistical class, I learned that there were 8 or 9 statistical distributions. And they were all different shapes, and they described all sorts of different sorts of things. So I once went back to the social department and said, how come we're only using the normal distribution when there's a whole bunch of other ones that are important? And I was told we teach that because it's easy to understand. It's easy to teach. And that, to me, in essence, is the problem with science nowadays, is we're taking the easy methods because they're easy to understand and maybe they're easy to get published in, but that doesn't mean they're accurate or they describe the reality around us. It just means it's easy to explain to someone else. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. If you've seen any of the books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the economist, trader, philosopher who writes about black swan events, anti-fragile phenomena, nonlinear processes, and generally the fragility of ordinary structures, you'll see a whole different point of view, is which we're overly confident in our models. And I think what this leads us to be is too narrowly focused and too easily dismissive of phenomena that don't fit conventional explanations. And it leads to type of tunnel vision. And every generation it gets worse and worse, and scientists are less likely to want to take risks. They want to just keep focusing on small, incrementally different topics rather than challenging the whole infrastructure, challenging the paradigm. So it becomes increasingly conservative, and eventually everyone's afraid to look outside the box. And we start ignoring the phenomena that don't fit within the box. So I could kind of feel this was happening in graduate school, and it was bugging me. So I came across another topic called fractal geometry. Fractal geometry, if you've ever seen fractals before, back in the 80s and 90s, they were kind of a new idea. But it was this idea that nature is based more around self-similar shapes and, you know, things that look increasingly detailed the closer you look. The way things really look in reality, in nature around us. And I found some support in a guy named Dr. Alan Berryman in the entomology department, who was kind of specialized in chaos theory, fractal geometry, Dr. Eldon Franz in the environmental sciences department. And this kind of math pointed to a whole different description of reality, where small changes could lead to big effects, and you really couldn't get linear measurements because things aren't really based on lines. Fractals, and this is kind of an interesting idea here based on what we're talking about tonight, were originally called mathematical monsters in the early 1900s because they were so hard to figure out because, as you know, if you've ever played around with fractals on a computer, the closer you look, the more detail you see. They never resolve to a line. There's always more detail as you magnify in. And you know, in the 80s and 90s, we started having computers that had the power to do this, even your own PC at home. So these fractals were very kind of important. This is kind of the Mandelbrot set, because they showed a different way of looking at reality that was not as easy to understand. We could get measurements of fractals based on the dimension of the edge, but it never resolved to a line. There was no fixed metric the way we were all brought up with in the mathematics and the science, and the kind of the way of thinking we were taught, that you can kind of figure things out and even have a feeling like you can predict things. Fractals told us that there were different types of structures in nature, and they were not, they were not linear in their essence. And because the normal distribution and modern statistics is based on linear prediction, this kind of model directly challenged that in my mind. And so, once I started studying this, I realized there could be phenomena that existed that we hadn't even studied yet. I didn't even have an idea what that would look like, but it just seemed to me, if all of the math I was being taught in graduate school was based on linear modeling, but that nature really looked a lot more like this, self-similar processes that looked the same, kind of called scale invariant. Maybe there were phenomena that science had missed. So I started being open to the idea that there could be whole sections of reality, this is just kind of theoretical at this point, that we hadn't discussed because they didn't fit linear models. It's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Like only studying the topics that were easy to fit into your linear models and ignoring everything else. The black swan events, the rare events, the phenomena that just didn't fit with our sort of ordinary common sense explanations. This is something called the Koch snowflake, and it just starts by iterating out from triangles and just keep adding more two sides of the triangles to all the edges, and it just keeps going on and on. This is what it looked like as a crop circle in the UK in 1997. Someone made their But this turns out to be a very important shape, and this is one of the shapes that I studied in my doctoral dissertation, because you can get measures of the dimensions of these objects. Now, our bodies are actually based around, much more around fractal geometry than they are lines, as you can see just by looking around at biological organisms, at yourself, these certain ratios that repeat, 5 ratios, spirals in our inner ear or in the shape of our hearts, things like this. So we're based on fractal shapes. Nature is often based on these self-similar repeating patterns, as you see in this broccoli romanesco, as it's called. So it's just very interesting that once you start looking at the way nature really works, fractal geometry, which was initially created by Benoit Mandelbrot as a science to study line noise in telephone signals, noise versus signals, that it actually describes the objects that we're all familiar with. And so fractals turn out to be objects that are between integer dimensions. Things that are between dimensions. Just let that sink in for a second. And clouds are an example of real-world fractals, because the closer you look in at a cloud, you'll find it's not really three-dimensional because it's made of droplets. And the smaller and smaller your scale, you'll see more and more droplets. It never resolves to a three-dimensional object or a line. So people that study fractals think that clouds are have a fractal dimension of 2.2, 2.3, between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, right? More than a table surface, but less than a completely solid object. And this starts to have practical application, because this is called the coastline of England example. When you think of how long is a particular coastline, you would imagine it could actually be measured in a definitive way. But it really depends on the size of your ruler, because if you kind of get an approximation of the coastline of England, it's about 2,400 kilometers, but that's if your ruler is really big, and that's kind of a rough estimate. As your ruler gets smaller and smaller, the length increases until it gets smaller and smaller. It goes up to 3,400 kilometers, and if your ruler gets smaller and is tiny and tinier, eventually the coastline of England would be infinite, because you're measuring between sand grains, not just the general length of a harbor, but you're going down between the rocks, between sand grains. You kind of get the idea. So the way we measure the world is sort of based on the tools that we've chosen ahead of time. It defines what we're going to see. And as we change the measurement instruments, we're going to see different types of reality. And ordinary common sense ideas like the length of the coastline all of a sudden don't make sense. And that's what fractal geometry shows us. Now, you all have fractal geometry, I am certain, right in your pockets, because it became the basis of cell phone antennas. Believe it or not, these really cool shapes that we used to just study in the sort of abstract turn out to be the basis of modern cell phones. Cell phones have fractally designed antennas that are self-similar at different scales. As you can see in the upper left, the guy that invented this is probably, really wealthy at this point, because we all have these cell phones with fractal antennas. And that fractalness allows the phone to pick up different types of wavelengths, cell phone frequencies in different bands, and choose which band is ever going to work the best at the moment. You've all seen this in your routers, whether it's 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz in this whole thing. So fractal geometry actually turns out to have a very practical application. It's not just a theoretical concept, but it's something that's built into our technologies now. And it's built into JPEG images. These very images use fractal algorithms. Rather than reproduce every single pixel in the photograph, you're probably aware how this works. You have an algorithm, and it just samples some of the dots and reproduces what it sort of expects to be there. And that's, this because when you magnify a JPEG image, you can see it's kind of grainy, but it kind of looks okay for a computer screen. So fractals are used in JPEG images, this idea of self-similarity. So let's fast forward now a little bit and go to what else was going on in WSU for me, just one floor up. I was in Wilson Hall. I showed you the building before. I was in the second floor, and on the third floor was the anthropology department where Dr. Grover Krantz worked. Dr. Grover Krantz was one of the first people to study Bigfoot in academia. And I never talked to Dr. Krantz, but I had friends, as I mentioned last year, who knew him, who hung out with him. And Krantz was really well known for analyzing these footprints, these casts of huge footprints from our very own Blue Mountains, just about starting about 80 miles from here. That's where a lot of these prints came from. Also, at the time, more recently, you've had Dr. Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University in Pocatello, and John Bindernagel from BC, who was another academic at the time. And in the first Bigfoot conference, I believe, was held in '78, and then there was another one at WSU in '89. I was there at the time, but I was being a good graduate student, staying focused, on my topics, and this wasn't something at the time that I was really even interested in. I don't even remember a conference being there or anything like that. But at the time, Bigfoot, to just argue that it existed was such a stretch from the conventional ideas in physiology, biology, anthropology, that these sorts of academics, the farthest they could take it was that it was some sort of unknown North American woodpecker, right? That they all faced a lot of opposition within their community, within academia. I've been reading Terrence Meaden's book about John Bindernagel called Discovering Sasquatch. And Bindernagel thought, if I just show the evidence, I'll convince my colleagues, the footprints, the hair samples, the witness sightings, and he couldn't convince anyone. He was so frustrated because his fellow scientists said, that's not enough evidence, and so even just saying that Sasquatch and Bigfoot existed was a real challenge, let alone to argue that it even had other properties, which we're about to talk about in a moment, right? So the original idea, which Grover suggested one time, was that this Bigfoot, this creature, that there had been sightings of it in the Blue Mountains. It was a Gigantopithecus blackie, some large ape that was discovered from having lived millions of years ago in China. All they ever found of Gigantopithecus is this jawbone that you see. That's all that's ever been discovered, and they recreated what they think the Gigantopithecus would look like. And this is still, to this day, this very common explanation that it's some sort of rare ape that survived through the ice ages. But there's no evidence Gigantopithecus ever crossed the Bering Straits. We have a lot of evidence when humans crossed the Bering Straits, and there's certainly debate about it, whether it was 30,000 years ago, based on these settlement patterns in South America, when did humans first get here, or whether humans came across on boats. There's a lot of debate about this, but there isn't any evidence for Gigantopithecus. It's just an idea that, as far as I know, Krantz suggested, and it sort of stuck because no one else had any other idea what Bigfoot could be. But they did have the big prints, and these, were around WSU, and I know people that have handled these and seen these and so forth. But there's no evidence Gigantopithecus crossed the Bering Straits, that there were any native apes in North America or anything like this. But this was the idea at the time that people started thinking what these giant creatures could come from. I recently heard just 2 weeks ago one of Krantz's students, Carlos Jimenez, His website is Chronicles of Carlos, and he was talking on the Untold Radio Network. You can listen to it on YouTube with Doug Hychek about his work with Grover Krantz. And he said that he was sent out to the Palouse Mountains where they had been sighted, and that he had a sighting himself when he went out there. I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about because I've attempted to contact him just a few days ago through Facebook, and he hasn't responded yet. I'm thinking he's talking about where the Palouse starts to meet the Bitterroots, kind of up in that direction, east of Tensed, Plumer, and those sort of towns out there where you can start to see the mountains get big. So maybe it's sort of in this area, but this is one case where we have sightings not too far away from Troy. In the past, this would have been in '96. But how did I get interested in this topic? I didn't click for me while I was at WSU. I was pretty much focused on my fractals and research methods and technology. I got involved when I got to Boulder, Colorado, where I live most of the time, with something called remote viewing. And remote viewing is this technique that came out of a Defense Intelligence Agency and a CIA program to create psychic spies in the 70s. The Pentagon found out that the Soviets had extensive psychic spy training and psychokinesis training for capable individuals, and the program was declassified in '95. And I won't go into this too much in detail, we can talk about it another time. But they began testing natural psychics, like you can see, you've heard of Uri Geller. There were others, Ingo Swan, Pat Price, the police commissioner from Burbank, California. And they created this project, eventually became known as Project Stargate. This is not the Stargate that President Trump talked about a couple of weeks ago having to do with AI. This is the original Project Stargate from the 70s, remote viewing training program. So I began teaching this, I learned it in '96. It's a type of intuition training. So my students began to tell me of their Bigfoot encounters in Colorado, the Colorado natives, over the years, starting in 1996. And I heard about these encounters for a couple decades before it really sunk into my thick skull that this was an important topic, because what they described wasn't something that seemed very easy to explain. One fellow described being pulled out of a tent in the middle of the night in a completely empty campground where he was camping by himself during high school up in Nederland, Colorado. And he said the strength was so strong it was like being pulled out by a jet, just like flying out of the tent, and just stopped. And the G-force, this guy's big, he's 6'4". The G-forces were so strong that he was pulled into the foot of the sleeping bag. When he finally popped his head out, there wasn't anything there. That was one sort of case I heard about. Another woman described a kind of mind speak, a telepathic communication in her house north of Colorado Springs, where she kind of had this visualization as she was going to sleep, and this huge orange-haired Sasquatch was right there on the porch, and her roommate saw it through the doors of the kitchen. What she had seen in her mind's eye was exactly what her roommate had seen, but she actually never physically saw it. Another fellow described a realtor being in rural southern Colorado and seeing something walk on two legs that he was sure was not a bear. So these cases finally, it started to sink in that this was a real topic that people were experiencing. And eventually I discovered the Sasquatch outpost in Bailey, Colorado, which had a lot of evidence. It was about an hour from Boulder, and there was a map there. When I looked at that map, there were dots for tree structures, footprints, howls and screams, and even more recently, rocks getting thrown at people, as you know, is kind of one of the symptoms that the Bigfoot are around. And I looked at that map, and I saw there were lots of dots everywhere. They were all around Boulder and up and down the Front Range in Colorado. So I finally, for all of us, if you've been brought up a certain way, it takes a while to see reality from a different point of view. Even those of us who are open to different points of view, who study alternate mathematical models and so forth. And I realized what we were dealing with was what we call hidden events. Hidden events are things that people experience that they're unlikely to talk about with other people because they're afraid of ostracism and ridicule, and I'm sure all the things that some of the early Sasquatch researchers had to deal with. None of us, like to be laughed at or penalized for saying certain things that we've seen, so we tend to suppress talking about these things, and it doesn't just apply to Sasquatch, but anything pretty much that we call paranormal, even things like UFOs and so forth, which has seen more public discussion, as you've noticed recently in Congress and so forth. So hidden events eventually become less hidden, but it seems to me that Sasquatch Bigfoot is an example of this, because when you begin talking to people about these sorts of experiences, you will hear more people who've had this sort of contact, who've seen something like this, and they may have never shared it with anyone before. And as I mentioned last year, just one example of this is child abuse, which wasn't considered real until the mid-1960s, until there were a couple national meetings about it with different professionals and law enforcement and so forth. And they decided it's really happening, that parents are abusing their kids, but it wasn't believed that parents would do that, and it wasn't something that people talked about before around 1965. It wasn't considered a real diagnosis. So even ordinary phenomena that we experience in society can be hidden events. But it seems to me any of the contact we have with different sorts of life forms that are not normally in our field of view are also hidden events. But there's a second reason, we didn't go into this last year. A lot of people who've had contact with Sasquatch and Bigfoot and other types of creatures that sort of belong in that sort of category are so stressed out about it that they don't want to remember it. And you could see this in the Flash of Beauty movie, Bigfoot Revealed, the first Flash of Beauty movie, where they had these psychological professionals at the end of the film saying that if you experience something like this that seems so far removed from what you're taught is real, that you're likely to forget about it. You won't even remember the experience. And I've heard some witnesses say to these types of creatures that they literally forgot about it within 10 or 15 minutes. They had, like, maybe they're driving on a road and there's a friend driving behind, they have two vehicles, and they both see something, and if it hadn't been for the second person reminding them, what was that we saw on the road, they had totally forgotten it by the time they got home, because it's so different and it doesn't fit. And maybe you've had experiences like this too, where you saw something, it could even be something like ball lightning or orbs, or just something that doesn't fit our conventional worldview. So this sort of leads to memory loss, time loss, which happens to people sometimes, one of the reasons for time loss, and confabulation, where you could invent another sort of explanation in your mind. You could fill in the gap with something else, something that's a little easier for your mind to process, because we all have these very strong defensive mechanisms. And again, it all comes down to being mammals. We're part of larger groups, and it's very important for us to have that group membership, and we don't want to do anything that we feel is going to lower, our social status within society, within our families, our groups, the organizations we're in. So these are two reasons, I think, why people often don't talk about Sasquatch, let alone the threats they sometimes receive for people that work in forest-related industries like loggers, or people that work for the National Forest Service or National Park Service, who are told in no uncertain terms that we don't talk about this here. You've all heard cases like this. And if you talk about it, you'll be unemployed within 24 hours. That sort of thing will discourage you from talking about it even more. And this happens if you read accounts of people that work as national park rangers and other national organizations that deal with land, BLM and so forth, that this is sort of what their superiors tell them when they report their sightings. So my first contact, with the phenomenon, if I go back in my mind, has to be the Patterson-Gimlin film. This was shown in movie theaters, at least where I lived back in New York, as a preview. It was about 10 minutes long. And, it was something that really made an impression. I think I saw this in the early 70s. The event happened in 1967. Patterson and Gimlin are two cowboys from Yakima, and they knew about this area where, since the 50s, there had been sightings in Bluff Creek. The first sightings we know about in Bluff Creek were from this road construction group working to build roads there. And Jerry Crew, who you see there holding this giant footprint, named this creature Bigfoot because of the size of the prints. And they found, when they were building this road, that they would come back the next morning and huge oil drums and things that weighed hundreds of pounds would have been tossed around like little paperweights. Big equipment turned over. These creatures obviously did not like someone messing around with their forest. It's quite understandable. So they were vandalizing the road construction equipment, and they left big footprints. And that's why Patterson and Gimlin ended up in Bluff Creek. Patterson actually had written a book about Bigfoot, and this is an interesting book. It's a collection of newspaper articles that show us that this is something, again, that's been around. This is part of American history. It's been around for hundreds of years. The name wasn't, people didn't call it Bigfoot until the 1950s. There were different names for them in the past, wild men, mountain devils, things like that. Often when you find a name, Devil's Peak or, Devil's Gulch, it sometimes has a Bigfoot connection, because this is what they were called, by cowboys and people hundreds of years ago, before the modern era. The Bigfoot name is kind of new. And of course, Native Americans, there are literally hundreds of names for Bigfoot and Sasquatch. If you talk to Native Americans, they'll share stories from their clan. But even Native Americans, as I found out, don't share this information about Sasquatch, or they call, the Gokit in Alaska, Sabe, or Sietko on the Pacific coast. There's so many different names. They don't share it with the tribe overall. They kind of keep it restricted to their family, to their particular clan. And I know one Native American who still won't tell me what they called Sasquatch in central Alaska, because he told me they believe that if you even say the name, it will summon them and they don't want to be around them. That Native Americans have very wide-ranging experience and history with Sasquatch and Bigfoot in this country. They say that Bigfoot and Sasquatch was here when they got here, thousands of years ago. So that must have been quite even a shock for the Sasquatch at the time to have humans show up like that, other types of humans than them. And so they don't always share the information either. And their experience with Sasquatch is quite varied, all the way from a creature that seems to be like a forest protector, something that you respect, maybe you avoid, but you stay out of the way, respect it, to something that's really fearful and scary and potentially violent. So there's just a huge range of experiences of Sasquatch from those traditions. And David Paulides has written very good books, Tribal Bigfoot and the Hoopa Project, about Native Americans. And because Sasquatch tend to show up more on Native American reservations, they have a lot more contact with them to this day. He also wrote a book going into the history of looking at newspaper articles and accounts from hundreds of years ago, which again reinforces the Patterson book. But looking in our own local area, you're probably aware that this document exists from 1975, right? which was the Washington Environmental Analysis from the Army Corps of Engineers. And they say that Sasquatch is a native animal to Washington State. This is something that the Army Corps of Engineers did. It's called like an environmental impact statement. And anything having to do with development, requires, I think it's legally required to do an environmental impact statement. And so this would have been part of their environmental impact statement for these giant dams that were built on the Columbia and so forth. Some of which are, are in Northern California, other places are now being taken down. But this is a page from the book, and they describe this as being something that's native to Washington. They do say it's controversial whether it really exists, and yet here they have this map with sightings before 1968 and after 1968, all over Washington State. So this is one piece of evidence we have from our own government that this is a real creature and that it really exists. And another document that I saw in the Bailey Sasquatch outpost in Colorado was this survey form from Mount Hood National Forest where it's a Bigfoot sighting report, and they want the people that work in that particular office, this fire zone, as you see, to report their Bigfoot sightings to the National Forest Service. So someone's keeping track of these creatures. It did say on here that joke reports will not be submitted to the database. So they meant it here, and this is an actual picture that someone that worked for the Forest Service took. So whether the U.S. government thinks, believes that these exist, they do, or they would not have forms like this. So a great source of information for our local area is the Bigfoot of the Blues book by Vance Orchard. Vance Orchard was this newspaper reporter that worked in the Tri-Cities area. He lived in Walla Walla, I believe. And this Bigfoot of the Blues book, which is now out of print, but there was a copy, several copies in this used bookstore in Walla Walla that a friend pointed out to me. Goes into the whole history of these sightings and talks about the 80s and 90s and all of the experience by Mill Creek and in that watershed area and in this huge area that is the Blue Mountains that goes into Oregon, as those of you who are here know about. So this is a very good source of information. Even reading Vance Orchard's book, though, he does talk about strange experiences around Bigfoot. The proponents of the idea that Bigfoot is simply a rare relic primate, don't want to look at any of the sort of unusual experiences that people have around Bigfoot. But even in this book, Orchard talks about kids one time seeing the Bigfoot gliding over the forest rather than walking. A very strange experience where a group of the people that are kind of central characters in the book lose about 5 hours of time around the campfire. It's 1 a.m. and all of a sudden it's 6 a.m. and the fire's out and no one knows what happened. And also strange objects showing up in and around the area where they're in. In one case, it's like a huge metal water tower that's gone the next day. A little hard to do for a water tower. So you kind of wonder what they're experiencing. And the more research you do into this topic, the more connections you see to other types of paranormal phenomena. And I don't think that's something that we should avoid and push off to the side of the discussion just because it makes it a little harder to understand. It's an extremely strange topic. There's no way to get around it, but that to me seems like an invitation to go a little deeper into what actually may be going on here. Rather than saying, oh no, scientists won't accept us if we talk about anything weird. I mean, in Jeff Meldrum's review of Bigfoot of the Blues, he criticizes Vance Orchard for mentioning some of these other strange phenomena that happened around him. But look, my training as a sociologist is you don't tell witnesses what to think, what to say. You listen to them. It may not fit your preconceived ideas. Tough. You have to listen to what they're telling you. You don't know what it means at first, but you have to record it. Otherwise, you're exhibiting bias. And you're doing what I talked about at the beginning here, is you're imposing your preconceived ideas on reality rather than reality telling you what it is. So my view is that even going back to this literature from the past, you see a lot of references to paranormal phenomena. Let's take a look at this Paul Freeman footage. This is, let me turn the speaker back on here. This is the Paul Freeman footage. Paul Freeman was a forest worker who is this larger-than-life character. There's a new book out about him by his son, Michael Freeman, who was just loved being outdoors. He was this big, huge guy that wasn't afraid of anything, and he had seen Bigfoot. He started seeing the tracks. He worked in the Umatilla National Forest, right? And he saw the tracks back in the 80s, and then eventually he gets this film from 1994. So let's take a look at this.
See much up through here. I hear the brush popping and stuff. Oh, there he goes.
Let me get one more last shot of the creature right there.
Get up here, let him see me quick. Get up here. Get better picture.
Yeah, so this is, you know, you've seen the Patterson Gimlin footage, but this is pretty much just as, not quite as long, but it's still pretty close up. I mean, either this is Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or this is some person in a suit, but I would say this is the real deal, in my view. And you have to remember, they had the footprints there for decades, and they had the footprints so carefully described, they knew them by name. They gave names to these particular creatures, the kids, the mom, the father. You know, they actually knew these because Paul was up there so much, you could identify them by almost by the dermal ridges, you know, it's like fingerprints in these giant footprints. So that's considered, you know, there's a lot of footage on YouTube. A lot of it seems to me to be the real thing. It's harder to tell nowadays with special effects and so forth, but this is 1994 before we had any sort of special effects on computers, as far as I know. Certainly couldn't do anything like this, and Freeman is the type of guy to be involved with that. And this is the best technology we have at the time, those little handheld VCR recorders. Some of you are probably too young to remember these, but they actually used to tape. You know, we had VHS-C, and then we had 8, and then high 8, which is a little more resolution. So this is the best, pretty much, for consumer use, this is the best you could get at the time. And so this is something that just would have been, this is northern Oregon, so this would have been about 100 miles from us here. And this is this book, this newer book, which I just started reading, and there's all the footprints, a lot of them that ended up at WSU, pretty large print. The soil that we have around here is so fine-grained, according to Jeff Meldrum, it's from the Pleistocene, which is, you know, like a long time ago, like the dinosaur ages. It's called the loess. That's how you pronounce it. It's this fine dust. You know it because you track it into the house. And it's really fine stuff, and it turns into these tiny little particles when you try to clean up, sweep it away. It makes the Palouse such a fertile place for agriculture. And it also is really good at preserving prints. And it's so good at preserving prints that you can actually see the dermal ridges, which you see on your hand and so forth, which we also have in our feet. These are actually preserved in these prints. There isn't any way that I know to actually, you know, poke something that finely detailed. So in my view, this is all quite real. In the past, you know, people spend so much energy trying to show why this would be a hoax. And Freeman, had his critics, Renee DeHinden and others, who just couldn't believe it. But I think at some point you just have to accept that the evidence is there, and it's your mindset that's, I'm not against being skeptical, but at some point there's just a lot of evidence, and these footprints are very, very good evidence that these creatures are out there, apart from video footage. Now, going back to some of the earlier cases, there was this case from Mount St. Helens where these miners had a cabin up on the mountain, and it's called, Nattoh Ape Canyon. It was called Ape Canyon. Why did they call it? Why is it called Ape Canyon? Because this is where the creatures were. And this happened all the way back in 1924, and Fred Beck wrote this book about it. But even in this book, he talks about experiences that we call paranormal. Paranormal, not being some sort of derogative name, at least for me, it just means sort of para means next to, so it's sort of another type of set of experiences next to this ordinary reality that we are used to perceiving. And he described this all the way back in 1924. So my bent is that these sort of experiences of time loss and orbs and various types of telepathic mind speak and invisibility that we'll get into in a moment are actually real experiences that people are having, not something that we should be pushing away. They're some part of other type of physics that we don't understand very well. So a few years ago, I went to a conference in Forks, Washington. They've had a Bigfoot conference there for a couple of years in a row, and they were showing the Flash of Beauty film, and I was asked to go out there just to answer questions about the film, the second film, Paranormal Bigfoot. And there was this fellow there, Neil, from the Spokane tribe. And this is really what, for me, closed off the idea that we're dealing here with a rare ape. He said his grandfather traded with Sasquatch as recently as 1913. And the last I checked, animals do not trade with people on a regular basis, on a yearly basis. I went up to him and asked him what the trade was. And he said his grandfather was a salmon fisherman. And if grandfather would leave salmon and the Bigfoot would give them, the tribe, medicinal plants from way up in the mountains. So it was a trade of salmon for medicinal plants. And if you've heard Dave Paulides talk about the history of Native American contact with Bigfoot, he mentioned a case in the 1920s in Oregon, I believe, where these three tribes, the Lumi, Quinault, and the Hancock, those are actually in Washington, but it was in that region where there was some sort of encounter that got the sheriff involved, and these three tribes, according to Paulides, held a press conference. I think he has the newspaper article where this is from. They held a press conference saying, don't hurt the Sasquatch, we trade with them. So this idea of trading with Sasquatch goes back quite a long ways. But just last fall, I was at a Sasquatch event in the Olympic National Forest. It's called Olympic Strange Days. And there was a woman there and her husband, who was a Macaque tribal member. And I mentioned Neil, and she said, oh, that's what his mother had said. That she had passed away a number of years ago, but she said they traded with Sasquatch right there, that sort of end of Washington there, the very northwest part, the tip. And I said, how recently? She said, until very recently. I said, what did they trade? Salmon for medicinal plants. So this seems to be something that, we have multiple witnesses to. And I think that if we have a creature that is trading with humans, it's more like a human than it is like an ape. More good evidence about Bigfoot comes from Ron Morehead, someone I've talked to a number of times. I've interviewed him on my YouTube channel. And he was the one that created these Sierra sounds, which we'll listen to in a moment. I'm sure some of you have heard this Sierra sound. But this is really strange. And the strangest thing about it, these are his 3 books, and very interesting experiences there. He goes up to this hunting structure in the early 70s. The Johnson brothers had been going up there since the 50s, and they had talked about some Sasquatch encounters. And he went up there, and he says that he encountered, and the group Sasquatch, 9 times, or 8 out of 9 visits, something like this, way up in the Sierra Nevadas. I'm told that the Forest Service took that hunting structure down, though someone named Paul Grant from the west side here, who has worked with historical preservation, says you could have argued it was a historical structure and give it some sort of historical protection status, as, you know, kind of a monument. But Ron ended up recording a lot of sounds of Sasquatch. And he said the strangest thing about it was you would never see them, even when they were right next to the hunting structure. These guys built this structure themselves out of trees up there, and to get up there, it was something like 8 miles on horseback straight up. There are no roads there, there's no way to drive out there, very hard to walk up there. So they bring everything up there on horseback. And Voices in the Wilderness is going to be coming out as a movie from the people that created Flash of Beauty, the Resonance Pro group in Portland. So this will become a movie and you'll be able to watch and see more about it. But what Ron told me a number of times is these creatures didn't even cast shadows on the hunting structure. There were gaps between the wood. You should have seen something moving. Then they put mics in the wall, and they never had any shadows. And when you'd stick your head out really quick, there was nothing there, but you could hear them talking right next to you. Extremely strange. So again, it's okay that it's strange. It doesn't fit with what our idea, what we're used to. So let's listen to some of these sounds.
Rain for night now.
So the wood knocking sounds first. And then you'll hear the whooping sounds. It's a sort of common. And then the sort of gibberish sounds. I've lowered his talking just so it's not too long. Let's hear it. They're talking back and forth with these creatures.
Like he talks to others and they talk to each other.
Yeah.
What kind of what?
So this goes on, I mean, there are hours and hours of this, and if you have time at the end after the Q&A, there's other tapes of them, of the creatures right next to the hunting structure, talking, you probably heard this gibberish, it's really fast. Again, he would never see him, but you could hear him. And some of the things that happened there, Ron would talk about one time they were in the hunting structure and it sounded like the entire camp was being taken apart, all the metal smashing their entire kitchens and pots and pans. And they expected to go out in the morning and see the whole place. It was a mess and nothing had been disturbed. So something about these life forms gives them the ability to be ventriloquist, mimic sounds. I mean, any sound they've ever heard, they can mimic perfectly. Sounds of car doors and cars, just everything. But just in contrast, let's listen to what the Ohio howl sounds. This is from Matt Moneymaker's recording. Another type of Bigfoot sound. So has anyone ever heard sounds like this?
I've heard that one, and so has my wife.
Where have you heard that?
I've heard it twice.
Where's that been? Around here?
Yeah. Neighboring town of Beauville.
Beauville, okay. We'll get to Beauville in a moment. We're going to talk about some of the local sightings. So those are really, I mean, the first sound, it's hard to make sense of what we're even hearing. It's like a gibberish, kind of like a caveman talk, or it sounds almost like the Flintstones or something. It's really strange sounding. But R. Scott Nelson, who worked as a cryptolinguist for the Navy, and when I saw him speak up at the Kalispell conference a couple of years ago, he described all the different foreign languages he could speak for, cryptographic purposes to, understand what the other side is talking about, from a military point of view. And he said that this is definitely a language, the Sierra sounds. It has articulated speech, which animals don't have. There are definite phonemes in the sounds, listening to the Sierra sounds. He said we can't figure out what they're saying, but they're phonemes, which are kind of like for us vowels. So there are these repeated sounds that make it what seems like human speech. But the difference is they're speaking both on the inhale and the exhale. We only speak on the exhale. Try speaking on an inhale. They speak on both, and this is why it's so rapid. They can just keep talking and talking. They don't have to take a breath in there. So it's this real rapid fire speech. Again, to me, this really puts it out of the realm of being apes. I mean, it's a primate in our direction. We're primates too. So, my view of this based on the evidence of trading and speech is that this is a type of human. This is a type of original human from a long time ago. I don't know where it fits on the family tree. I don't think anyone knows where it fits on the family tree. I mean, there really are no Bigfoot experts. I'm certainly not one, because nobody actually knows what we're dealing with here. But it's some type of human that is related to us in a way that we don't know. They're like cousins or something, but we've been separated from them for a long time. we don't have the ability to talk while we're inhaling and exhaling. There's some belief they even have two sets of vocal cords. So different biologically. So my first experience with a Bigfoot, if there is an expert, it'd be Igor Burtsev from Russia, who's been studying Bigfoot for over 50 years. He's a PhD in political science. And he switched to what they call in Russia hominology. They really study Bigfoot seriously. They call them the Almasti, something like the Almasti are like what we call Bigfoot. In that whole big continent of Russia and Asia and so forth. And he talked about witnesses seeing the Bigfoot dematerialize in front of their eyes. He talked about one case in a Moscow garden, Russia, where it was a 9-foot tall Bigfoot. They could tell from the telephone poles. And the woman said it was like a curtain of sparkly lights came down and it just vanished. So this is Don Monroe next to him. He studied a lot of this interesting phenomena of horses having their hair braided overnight, even when they're in their pens. Somehow in the morning their hair would be braided. So it seems that the Sasquatch, have these abilities to interact with horses, braid their hair. And again, at Montana, this conference in Kalispell, I ran into a woman, I mentioned this last year, who had never been to a conference before, any conference, on any topic, and I asked her what made her want to come to this conference, and she said she had seen a Bigfoot become invisible. Her dog saw it first. It was a juvenile or an adolescent. She said it just digitized in front of their eyes. And digitized. I said pixelated. She goes, yeah, it just became like little dots, which is exactly what Igor Burtsev talked about. So again, you listen to the witness experiences, it's consistent across continents. So these creatures, I don't know whether they're literally becoming invisible or are they affecting us in some way that we don't see them anymore. That's another possibility. But invisibility is one of their traits. So you could be around them. I mean, I'm not trying to scare you too much, but you could be around them and not know it. Or as some of you, we were talking before we can get into this in the Q&A, they often have a shimmer around them and they look like the Predator from the Predator movie. A kind of a blurry, shimmery images moving between the trees. So if you see something like that out there while you're walking in the woods, it could be real. It's not your eyes getting blurry. It's a Sasquatch kind of checking you out. How they actually do this, it's a really good question. Stan Gordon's talked about this a lot. He's a researcher from Pennsylvania. He was originally studying UFOs, and then, as he puts, he started this in the early 60s. Like, he's another original researcher. Bigfoot reports started coming into the UFO sightings in the same area, sometimes in the same field. And if you check out his books, I just had a chance to talk with him again in January, coming back from the New York area. I stopped to say hello. And he's done a lot of great research on orbs around Bigfoot, UFO connections, and so forth. So for Stan, this is not even something that's a question anymore. The UFO phenomena seems to be related to Bigfoot also, for reasons we don't totally understand. But again, that moves it for me away from it being just a rare North American wood ape. There's something about it that has a connection to what we call the paranormal. And I don't think that's something we should push away and feel afraid of. Oh, we can't talk about it. People may not like us, scientists may think we're weird. Okay, big deal. That's what the witnesses tell us they're seeing. The silent invasion is just full of these great encounters. But the invisibility, it's not just that they become invisible. He gives cases where they're partly visible and partly invisible, or in bands. Maybe that's giving us a clue, like a wave of invisibility from the top down. Really strange stuff. There's one more thing I should mention about the sounds. This is the really strange thing about Bigfoot and sounds. As you know, if you've listened to any podcasts or talked to people who've experienced this, people say they're louder than a freight train. It's the loudest thing, that type of Ohio howl. If if you're near it. It's the loudest thing they've ever heard in their life. It makes their ears ring, and it makes your internal organs vibrate as if you're standing in front of a speaker at a rock concert. That's how loud it is. You know, I don't think it's just lung capacity that's doing that. Because people who've experienced this sound that feel like they want to run away in terror ask other people later on, did you hear that, who were just maybe 100 yards away and they heard nothing. So it's directed sound, what we could call coherent sound. And this will be coming out a little more in the third Flash of Beauty movie that'll be coming out in the future, not too long from now. So they have this ability to look invisible, or you know, to our eyes appear invisible, or maybe they're really changing, cloaking, you know, metamaterials in science, bending light in some way. But they're also doing something with sound, like a laser focused sound, which, you know, is different from sound we're used to. Normally we're used to sound spreading out evenly, and this is directed. So another interesting source of information is James Shubsky at Margie's Outdoor Store over in Bingen, Washington. I stopped in there not too long ago, and he just had this outdoor store because it's an outdoor area along the Columbia River Gorge there. And he got so many reports of strange creatures around his area that he set up a reporting station. He's a guy that's into graphics and maps and things. So he put a reporting station right there in the store and a laptop. And he's recorded all sorts of cases of Bigfoot and other types of creatures in the area. And again, this is not too far away from us. And it's the same reports over and over again. One thing we look for in science is repeatability. Well, we've got it with these topics because these creatures and this type of phenomena, because it seems to be the same thing over and over again, even in different parts of the world. So how do we find sightings in our area? The BFRO.net site is good for this. It doesn't look to me like it's been updated in a while, but you can look by state and then you can look by county. These are some of the cases right from Latah County. We talked about these last year, but those of you that are interested, just click on Idaho, Latah County. From my look at the site just yesterday, it looks like Latah County has like the 5th most sightings of all the counties in Idaho. The number 1 county is Bonner County, way to the north of us, as you might expect, up by Sandpoint in that area. But here are some cases just right around here. October 2020, Bowville. You may know this fellow. Do you know this fellow who experienced?
I've probably heard him before.
Yeah, this hunter that said he grew up in this area and he heard wood knocking sounds and he said, I'm tough, I've got my shotgun, I've got slugs. And he starts going towards the area and he's overcome by this terror, which is also another common feature of Bigfoot encounters. Witnesses, I know, friends who've experienced this type of terror around a Bigfoot say it's like the projected sound. It has pinpoint accuracy, it's like directed at you and you know it's coming from outside. And it turns on like a switch and it turns off like a switch. But when you're feeling it, it's the most terrifying feeling you've ever felt in your life. So again, a predator, this would be a very good way to hunt, just to create this fear and this paralysis. But they turn it on and then they turn it off. As soon as the Bigfoot's gone, it just evaporates. Unlike other experiences you've ever had, scary experiences, it kind of lingers for a while. This doesn't linger, it's like, it's gone. So this hunter in Bowville said this is what he experienced. And he had been in that area his whole life, 7 miles south of Bowville. There's a crossing on Highway 95 in 2011. This woman said the Bigfoot just disappeared as it crossed the road. There was a big open ditch there. This is south of the rest stop, right before you go around that curve, going towards Potlatch, a couple miles south of the rest area. And she said even her cat was afraid of her when she got back. Her cat ran under the bed. So this is a little odd. There's something about Bigfoot that it leaves this sort of vibe around you. It affects you in some way that your pets can detect. And they will kind of be afraid when you come in the door. They know something. There's this sighting on Moscow Mountain in 2005 from these tourists up there. They thought it was a person and a dog, and as it got closer, they saw it was a Sasquatch and a younger Sasquatch running around. This seems to have been to the east of Idler's Rest, from what I could tell from this report. There was a crossing in 2003, Highway 6 up by Harvard, somewhere up by that area, across the road. And this interesting case from 63, this earliest account I can tell, which is just a couple miles away from us here. This boy remembers he was out there with his father, who was a logger, who had been given permission to log this area, and the father said, "Oh, just go and take off for a while. I'm going to do my work." And he climbs a tree, and he said a chimpanzee climbed up the tree with him, nose to nose. And as he got up the tree, it kept going up the tree, and they were so convinced it was a chimp that the father called around to see if any circuses had been through the area that had lost a chimpanzee, but no circuses had been through the police. And years later, the boy thinks, wait a minute, there's no chimpanzees in Nattoh forests around here. This was the Sasquatch. And the other piece of evidence, by the way, which I didn't mention last time, was that they said all the cows in that area seemed really spooked. They seemed to be really on edge, which is typical of the Sasquatch. And finally, this very interesting case from 2017, where this woman from Tencent said that she saw a Bigfoot chasing deer, again, right south of the rest area, and it caused her to crash. And we had someone here last year who talked to the policeman, who is it, I don't know if he's here again today. Yeah, and you said, the police said this woman was really shaken up, and she was, really, disturbed by this. It had reddish hair. She had a very specific description. She saw it in the rearview mirror and then hit one of the deer that was crossing. So these sightings are right in this area just south of Deep Lake Lane. You've all been by this on 95, right on that curve as you're coming into Potlatch. So that encounter in 2011 is around this area. From what I can tell, the 2017 encounter is just a couple miles north of here, a few miles south of the restaurant. So those are some local encounters. I'm sure there are more, because only maybe, what do you think, 5 or 10% of people actually report? So, but just looking at this, I was looking at what does happen up in Bonner County. This was just one that popped out. I live in the mountains, I've been a logger all my life. I've never heard anything like this. It went on for 15 minutes, the scream in a low, deep voice, and my dogs wouldn't go outside. This is very typical of the way animals react to Sasquatch. Even the most fearless hunting dogs head for the hills, and he'd be way before the Sasquatch is even visible, right? They go back to the car, they hide under the bed. You've all heard this. And in these BFRO sightings, they're all followed up by BFRO approved investigators, and this is the longer report from this logger, which goes into great detail about how all the dogs in the neighborhood were silent, and it couldn't have been made by a human, it was too loud, and so on. So you kind of get the idea. So this is a very interesting resource if you want to look at encounters. 2 more encounters that I've read about recently. This is from Rusty Wilson's book. This is someone I've corresponded with. He's a fly fisherman teacher, Steamboat Springs. He also has classes in Montana, and he collects stories from his clients. I've interacted with him and the guy that does his audiobooks, Richard Hensel. And they can't guarantee these stories are true because they're just told to them, but Rusty says he uses his best sense of judgment, and these people seem really engaged in these stories, and he doesn't see why they would make them up since they don't even want to use their names. But in Rusty Wilson's books, and he has 24 of these, there were some from right around here. One was from a train engineer, train driver, coming out of Spokane by Marshall, Washington, right? Which is just to the east of the highway there as you're going up to Spokane. And he said he used to see the Sasquatch moving around the tracks. There's a lot of forest up there. He would see them in the area. And he said one time whole family crossed, and the last one didn't make it in time and they hit it. And everyone on the train could feel it. You could hear it, you could feel it. He said it was probably a bear, but he knew what it was because he had seen what was going on there, and he had seen it for years. He just never mentioned it. But he said they went back the next day, and there wasn't a trace of anything. There was no blood, there was no sign of a carcass or anything. But he definitely felt like they collided with one because he mentions how trains, they don't really project sound to the front. It comes out from the side, so you people can underestimate when they're getting too close. People get hit sometimes too. And then there was this very strange case from Colfax of this photographer. He said he had come down during the fall to take pictures of the beautiful Palouse wheat fields and so forth. And he said that something followed him back when he was out by Steptoe Butte to his Airbnb in Colfax. He said it was a butcher shop that had an Airbnb attached to it. If any of you know about this, I couldn't find any evidence of a butcher shop in Colfax, but this could have been from a couple decades ago. If you know about this, feel free to let me know. But he said it followed him back, and he got so creeped out that he left, and he got a call from the Airbnb owners who said that something had broken in and taken a whole side of beef off a hook that weighs hundreds of pounds. When he looked back at his photos, he said he could see something with glowing red eyes in the wheat fields in one corner of the pictures. He was using good 35mm film. You could enlarge it. And so that's another story from Rusty Wilson. But any of Rusty Wilson's books are very interesting. He has them by region, by national park, and there are lots of good cases from park rangers and other people who spend a lot of time outdoors. These are very interesting stories, and it just shows us the variation of experience people have with Bigfoot. People being rescued out there, kids falling into very cold streams up in Glacier National Park, and other people being chased out and really running for their lives to get out of the backcountry if they upset one of these creatures. So very interesting set of stories. Also, Rob Alley, someone I've met a couple times in Florence, not a place. He has a lot of stories from the Puget Sound all the way up the coast there on BC, Vancouver Island, all the way up to Alaska. He spent a lot of time in Alaska. And his two books are Brushes with Bigfoot and Raincoast Sasquatch. And he's a very good artist. He draws pictures like this of what the people have described to him in all sorts of scenarios. Very detailed descriptions of these creatures from Native Americans and Caucasian people encountering these creatures. But the main thing that Rob gets across to us is how Sasquatch likes to swim. And we know that apes do not really like water very much. They can be kind of trained to go into water, but they certainly don't swim naturally. But this is tons of cases of Sasquatch swimming, fishing, doing all these things, which again, to me, makes it seem much more in the human camp than in the ape camp. So the differences from apes are, complex language, swimming, reasoning, and these gifting relationships, maybe some of you experienced, where you leave things for them and they leave sometimes very odd objects that haven't existed in our reality for decades behind. They'll find little antiques and little crystals and things. If you want to interact with them, they really seem to like peanut butter and sweets. People say the jar is completely emptied and the cap's put back on. So this is something that I've talked to people about, and often people don't share their gifting relationships. It feels very special to them. And this is how you develop nice, positive relationships with the Bigfoot in your area. So finally, the things that are really interesting to me are the energetic and electric phenomena around Bigfoot. This is what my book, Dark Matter Monsters, is about. Because so many of the witnesses I encountered in Colorado and now all over the Northwest tell me about battery failure, camera failure around Sasquatch, lights on the outside all of a sudden just don't work, just when you want the lights to go on. This sudden quiet, the Beauville hunter mentioned that, just an odd, deep quiet that comes over the forest, not even the insects make any sounds. That's one characteristic that seems to come up over and over again. Electronic failure, orbs, ball lightning that seem to show up around the Sasquatch, sometimes being emitted by the Sasquatch. Again, I don't think this is something we should be pushing away. We're not putting that in our report. Some of these websites have been accused of filtering out all this type of thing. To me, this is very interesting electromagnetic data that show us we're dealing with a creature that can manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum. I mean, we all believe in electric eels. They generate electricity, so why wouldn't a land creature be able to do this too? Temperature changes, sudden cold. and mental confusion and sudden loss of time. Hours go by and all of a sudden you just come back to your consciousness and you're still standing there without feeling sore. Extremely strange. The Sasquatch, some of the characteristics, again, that do not, to me, don't seem to really make them fit with ordinary animals or even humans, is that the eyes emit light, they glow in different colors, yellow, red, blue, green. Jet-like speeds, they almost look like a cartoon character. They're so fast, people have described them moving, it's like, you know, the Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny. Cloaking, the invisibility, the super loud, directed, focused sound, like a laser beam. And then the rock throwing is something that's, well, that can be pretty serious. People have been injured by this. I've spoken to people that have experienced it. Hiking up in Estes Park, the rocks can come so close. It's like the Bigfoot have such good aim that, I mean, they could have hit you if they wanted to, and it just comes literally within an inch of your face. It's almost enough to knock you down just from the reaction to it. So they're really good with rocks. And of course, you've heard this over and over again of people having pebbles thrown on their tents all night, and then they get bigger. And they can be pretty big rocks that can do a lot of damage to your vehicle or yourself if you get hit by them. So this one example, again, someone who I got in contact with, she had been out at the China Lake Naval Weapons Station in California, and Smithsonian is an archaeology exhibition. They're given permission to go out to this military base, and she said, it was 3 guys and her, one guy at 2 tents, so she was with one guy, and she started feeling her face being touched through the tent, and she thought it was the other guy getting, funny with her on the other side of the tent, a friend of her, but it wasn't. He was asleep. And so they all run out at the same time, and they see this, what she described as like a juvenile, like 6 foot tall Bigfoot with glowing yellow eyes. She said it was the longest minute of her life. It's on my YouTube channel. Just staring. She said you couldn't move your eyes away. It was just mesmerizing, this stare. They saw footprints the next day, and none of them took pictures of it. And she later talked to an American Indian, and he said, oh, they can mess with your mind, and if they don't want you to take pictures. And she couldn't find any other explanation that made sense. They all had the best possible cameras. They're working for the Smithsonian, and they don't take pictures of the footprints in the snow. It was in early March. So again, if you want to look at my ideas about this, it's on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Fractal Friend. And I'm interested in the electromagnetic effects because there's a lot of similarities between what people experience around Bigfoot and what we call cold fusion. It's now called low energy nuclear reaction, different states of condensed matter. And various researchers that have looked at these types of matter, Takaaki, Matsumoto, Ken Shoulders, Alexander Parkhomov, the Russian scientists, when I look at their research and they describe these temperature changes as the lab getting cold when they turn the experiments on, the orbs that get emitted by these experiments, and the types of phenomena that happen in their lab, it seems sort of similar to what people experience around Bigfoot, which again suggests to me that the Bigfoot, either through sound or other means, is able to create coherent matter in their environment and sort of change the structure of the electromagnetic spectrum. It sounds like a really wild and crazy idea, but it seems to me that's what the data suggests. And again, we know animals that can do something like that already. So maybe there's a type of human that has been around longer than we have that knows how to manipulate energy that we still don't quite understand how to do. We think we need machines to do it, and they just know how to do it by directly interacting with nature. So this is kind of an epilogue here. I didn't show this last year, but I had a friend visit me in Boulder, someone I had known from remote viewing training from the 90s. We hadn't seen each other in a while. We thought it'd be fun just to meet up and share notes. She told me, this is December 2021. I'm still working on dark matter monsters. And she told me later that she was just laughing at me the whole time inside. She thought, oh, it's another one of these Bigfoot kooks. Don't these people realize this is just a hoax, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know this at the time. She was listening, but she told me later she thought I was like a complete idiot getting involved with this topic. She goes back on the way home to their vacation condo in northern Arizona, and she sees these tree structures, very odd tree structures at right angles, where there haven't been any windstorms, and they're just lying across other trees for no reason. And she goes, oh, so Simeon was talking about these tree structures. Maybe that's it. So she thinks, well, maybe it's just the local park service straightening trees. And then she sees these. These are her photos. She's given me permission to show you these. Teepee-like tree structures, just leaning against other trees. She said, oh, that had to be Boy Scouts, but Simeon did talk about tree structures. Maybe this is it. And then she starts playing with the tree structures. This is kind of a no-no. I wouldn't advise this, because the next thing she notices, weird sticks are leaning up against the back of the building while she's there alone. This is like a movie. I wouldn't have believed this if I hadn't, it wasn't her telling me this. Sticks start showing up against the back of the house, and she notices a weird smell. It's a wet dog smell around the place. And she said there had always been these weird howling sounds at night, but her parents said, oh, this is just forest animals. So she had been someone, in my view, had been experiencing the Sasquatch phenomena for years and years up there, but didn't know what it was and rationalized it away like a lot of us might have done. Oh, that's just forest animals. It's a wet dog out there. It's the Forest Service. It's Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts experimenting with TV structure. She never saw any Boy Scouts, but it had to be Boy Scouts, right? What else could do that? So she goes back to her, goes back to Phoenix, and then she thinks, are they really up there? I'm an adult. I don't believe in these things. She goes back again by herself, and she's doing a meditation, and she says the meditation started to feel really strange. And she opened her eyes, and that was looking at her out the window, 100 feet away, leaned up against a tree. And this is her drawing of herself at 5'2". And the creature in a crouching position is as tall as she is standing up. But she said when it stood up, that's when it was a real shock. It was 12 to 18 feet tall. And it was playing a game with her, she said. It went behind a tree and peeked out. And then went behind another tree. And she said she felt like a mouse in a trap. I mean, it's just the feeling. Like this thing was like, had been out there for years and had been watching her. And these creatures had been there the whole time. There was some strange vandalism to the park. The benches had been pulled out by the cement balls, which are very heavy, but there was no indication of what had done it. So she had an indication something very big and strong was around. And then she sees this, and just like in a movie, she said she just ran out of there into the garage, got the car, and didn't even lock the doors, take her laptop, or turn out the lights. And she never went back. So it goes from meeting an author writing about Bigfoot, and thinking, aha, what are these naive people who believe in these things, to encountering it. Now, I have wondered, did our discussion about it have anything to do with them actually showing up? I don't know. It's just speculation. But it seems like something you would see in like a horror movie where it just keeps getting worse and worse. And eventually you're just gunning out of the garage at 60 miles an hour. But anyway, that was her experience. It's kind of just, I have never personally seen Sasquatch that I remember, but now I have a good friend who's seen them quite close up. So, one more thing about the types of creatures we're dealing with here. It's not just Bigfoot. And James Shubsky at Margie's Outdoor Store has talked about this, and I've heard about this from other American Indians and other people. There are also the little people, the bugwas, as Thomas Seawood calls them. The bugwas are small, smaller people that are not Bigfoot. They're something else. And I was just speaking to someone 2 weeks ago who said his Native American grandmother, Shoshone tribe, talked about them when he was a kid, being around the area of Salmon, Idaho, in that direction. That way, towards Montana, right? And then he ran into a miner who said that he had actually seen something like this. He didn't know what they were, but up in an area around him. There's also the Klickitat ape cat, which James Shupsky says there are 140 registered sightings in his reporting station alone from the past couple of decades. It's a huge cat. James was just talking about it at the Baker City Bigfoot event last weekend. And I didn't go, but I was able to see it on the live stream. And he said like a cougar comes up to about here, and you know, like an African lion, something like this, but the Klickitat ape cat comes up to like the height of the top of a small compact car, like this high. It's shoulder height to you. It's never been aggressive. No, there's not a single aggressive story about them. They always leave. But the weird thing about them is some of them have the face of an ape. Again, this isn't something that fits in any of our ideas about animals we were taught to believe in, but you have 140 consistent sightings over a couple decades, and some of them very recent, right in his store. James thinks it might have something to do with the Hanford nuclear reactor, which has been going since, was it the 40s? At one time, the biggest nuclear reactor in the U.S. for creating plutonium, right? And there were animal experiments there, the cases of the alligators escaping that had been radiated. So maybe one theory is that it's a type of mutated animal, but we really don't know. And at this point, I could believe there could be many reasons. Then there's dogmen. You've heard about dogmen. They're a wolf-like human biped on two legs. They don't seem to really, you don't seem to have gifting relationships with dogmen. Just from what I read is these encounters. Now, talking to Stan Gordon, he said he thought they're a variant, they're another type of Bigfoot with a snout, but they do have different behaviors and they seem very intimidating. And they're reported in many states, especially back east, Michigan and other places. And finally, there's more cryptids than this, and some people don't think Bigfoot is a cryptid. Some people think Bigfoot is a human, like us, a different type of human, a paranormal human, as Ebert sort of calls them. But they're also thunderbirds. I've spoken to people who said they know people who've seen these thunderbirds, northern, Montana, Wyoming area, Red Lodge, and so forth. You hear reports of these pterodactyl type creatures all over the country. In particular, Stan Gordon in Pennsylvania has told me about cases of ornithologists, bird specialists working at universities who thought they were encountering a Piper Cub plane until it's flapped. That's how big the wingspan is, 10, 12 feet, even bigger. And they, of course, did not mention it to any of their colleagues for fear of ridicule. But he said, 2 ornithologists, and you can read accounts of these creatures. Where do they live when we don't see them? Where, how do they have families? Where are the nests? I don't know the answers to these questions, but the reports are very consistent, right? So here's the 2 movies that I think are good introductions to this, and I'm in the second one, Paranormal Bigfoot. These are witnesses to orbs and different phenomena. There's even a great witness in Paranormal Bigfoot that talks about shape-shifting, Bigfoot turning into deer. Even my university-trained mind has a lot of challenges believing that, but Jack gives in these descriptions. It's really worth watching. If you go to YouTube, they put all the excerpts of these people. You can watch for free the excerpts of the interviews on the Flash of Beauty YouTube channel. And again, it's just very interesting because even Rob Alley talked about some of these shape-shifting cases in the Brushes with Bigfoot book, and he said it's hard to believe that this is what people describe as them instantaneously, changing into something else. Why not? More locally, this is a great set of books from Becky Cook from the Idaho Springs area, Idaho Falls, Pocatello area. She was a reporter. They had a sighting, according to her, around the time of a Bigfoot conference in her backyard. A whole bunch of researchers were there and the creatures came in. She has Bigfoot Lives in Idaho and all sorts of variations on Bigfoot Lives in Idaho books. And these are all cases from Idaho. from all over the state. Fascinating cases of people's encounters. The closest I could find in Becky's books are Coeur d'Alene area to us so far in reading her books. I haven't seen any closer to the Troy, Deary, Vogel, Moscow area. But these are a lot of fun, and you can find these. So again, thanks for listening. These are my ideas about it. You're welcome to challenge me, not believe it, create your own ideas, but I'm interested in hearing some of your experiences. You can always contact me from my blog, New Crystal Mind. There's a contact form. You can always say hi or share your experiences. And does anyone have any comments? You want to share any experiences? Feel free.
Yeah, I got a question for you. I watched Thinker Thunker and his report
Yeah.
on DNA.
Mhm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I look at the Thinker Thunker channel, and I like his analysis because it's like, he's a technical guy. He works on helicopter parts.
Yeah.
So he knows specifications and analysis and scientific method. So when he looks at the proportions and shows us that in a lot of these photos that humans have certain proportions from their hip to their feet and all these Sasquatch videos we have all over the internet, that the proportions are always really, the arms are much longer, legs are shorter, and so forth. I think that's some pretty good evidence that you're dealing with an animal, human, something that is, it's not like us. And it shows you that there's a difference. I mean, he's basically arguing against the idea that these are just people in monkey suits, right?
Right. Yeah. Because there's no way.
And he shows you the proportions. There's no way anyone's going to have arms like that. And you see articulated movement. Even in the Patterson-Gimlin film, as some of you have seen, they've done a lot of analysis where you see the muscles moving. And as you can see, as she turns around, there's no zipper on the back. You ever heard anyone make a suit with no zipper? Impossible. How would you, So you can see a lot even in that. I mean, our analysis has gotten better over the years. So even Patterson-Gimlin film, you can see a lot of motion in there. Once you have a physiologist show you what to look for that says humans don't walk like that. They don't put one foot in front of the other. They don't have, Thinker Thunker's done a lot of good work with the gait of the Bigfoot and showing how when we walk, we drag our feet a little bit. People have said when they're following Bigfoot tracks that they leave marks in the snow from the tip of their toe. But the Bigfoot seem to bring their feet up just like this, almost parallel to the ground. And we don't walk like that. So I think that's really interesting evidence, and it's a good channel to check out. Yeah.
I had a thought about the acoustics with this Euro sounds because of our farm where we live. It always startles people. We're in the family room at the back of our house, back of the property. How many feet would you say that is from the road there?
75 feet, maybe 80 feet.
Pretty far away from the, not right on the road, and it sounds like those farm trucks are right behind the house. And there are certain parts of the property where you could hear everything that's said pretty far away. And I'm wondering how much the Bigfoot maybe had a lot of fun scaring them because they weren't right next to them, but the acoustics could have made it seem like they were right next to it because sound does travel strangely.
It can do that.
Yeah.
And they really see, what part of the Northwest are you in?
Well, we're Genesee, but we can see Uniontown from our property.
Oh, got it, yeah.
And there's a lot of sights in the sky at night, and it took 3 months before I even brought it up to my family. Coming home from, you taking the Washington route, coming up from Lewiston, and there was an orb right next to me. Scared me half to death. I prayed out loud under my breath that if it's a demon, for Jesus to expel it.
By your car coming up?
Yeah.
Following the car?
I was in the passenger seat, and it took off like a shot as soon as I prayed out loud. And it took me 3 months and I'm talkative, I share everything, I've got no secrets. And it took me 3 months to even bring it up, because it rattled me that
An orb, ball lightning orb. What color?
It, similar to the right next to the lettering, dark matter, that color blue.
Yeah, so those,
And it scared me half to death.
those,
I did not know what
they're very strange. I've studied, there's a lot of research from Russia, Europe, going back decades in ball lightning. It's not as well known here in the US, but there's some Air Force reports about it, and estimate in one of these studies from '93 that 1 out of 20 Americans have seen ball lightning or orbs. But the weird thing about them is they have this intelligence. I can't explain this. I don't know.
I didn't want
it's
it
like
there.
following you, and then it takes off. I
And it was only after I prayed, it was following,
It
and
left.
I was looking at it and looking at it. It wasn't until I whispered a prayer it took off. And I'm wondering, how much of this stuff is possible that we're just being played with for some government experiment, for instance?
we don't totally know. It's a really good question.
Yeah.
And I don't totally know the answer. But it's good that it didn't come in the car because it can have a lot of damaging effects. It has a lot of negative health
I'm
effects.
not mean at that if it had.
Good. I'm glad it didn't come in. Sometimes it does, and sometimes there's no effect, and sometimes people have injuries from it, and sometimes
Yeah,
people are
it's scary.
killed by ball lightning, even
scary.
farm animals. So thanks. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it sounds nutty.
No, it's real, but it's something we don't talk about. So it took you 3 months even to talk about it because
To my own family.
it's your own.
They wish I had more secrets.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I had someone call me up one day, and he agreed to do an interview for my YouTube channel. He said, every single thing that you talked about in the Flash of Beauty Paranormal Bigfoot movie, we've seen it up in the Sierra area where Ron Morehead does a fight. We've gone up there by where the Sierra camp was in general. He said, every single thing you mentioned there, the glowing eyes, the orbs, the blur, and he said, we've seen it. So it's just so interesting that, this isn't just some sort of speculation people encounter these things, but who are you going to call?
Nobody.
Who do you call about this? Because if you call any of the authorities, they're going to say, you had a long day, didn't you, ma'am? If it's Bigfoot, of course, you saw a bear. It's a bear, right? And if it's Dogman, it was a pack of wolves, and you're just feeling a little stressed. Pack of dogs, wild dogs. So there isn't anywhere to talk about this, and yet so many people have had an experience with it, so thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share anything? Anyone who's had some encounters?
I was just going to ask a
Go
question.
ahead, go ahead.
So, this definitely isn't my grandfather's Bigfoot, the story that you're telling about some powers you explained. And I was having a hard time wrapping my mind around it until you brought up the predator analogy. And then suddenly it all made sense, which, what's the predator? It's an alien life form that's here secretly to study, to hunt. And so in modern Bigfoot study, is there a line of thought that maybe this is an alien race that's here in disguise, and this is how they, keep themselves away from because UFOs certainly are becoming more and more mainstream,
No, it's
study
true.
that. So is that the thought, or is it still that it really is a native Earth creature that just has these extremely alien-type powers?
It's a lot of speculation because we don't ultimately know. I think the main line of thought is it's still a terrestrial creature. But, when you look at Stan Gordon's research, there is a UFO connection, and it's not just in Stan Gordon's witnesses that this comes from in, Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania. But that certainly people suggest this idea that, it's some sort of alien. But when you listen to the language of it, and again, there's so much variation even across our own country. But the interesting thing is if you listen to the speech, the howls, it pretty much sounds like the same thing from Florida to Alaska, with the same sort of variation you might expect in humans in accent and dialect, right? Pronunciation from Florida to Alaska, there's quite a difference there. And you get that same type of variation with Bigfoot speech. But to me, it just seems more terrestrial, especially when you look at the hair analysis, the Melba Ketchum hair analysis from Texas, which suggested that it's I could be getting this wrong, but like 93% human and 7 or 8% something else. The mitochondria seems similar to our mitochondria, which comes from the female side. And there's something else in there that doesn't have any identification in any database. So maybe there's something else mixed in. I think we don't have a lot of answers to these questions. Anyone who thinks they do, they're making it up. We don't really know. I think if this was a more open topic and maybe if we had some input from the government eventually, they must know something about this given the amount of land that the federal government manages in states, you know. But it's a good question. Yeah, go ahead.
How about our Canadian neighbors to the north? Do they
Yeah.
have much information on this type of stuff?
Oh, yeah, yeah, and a lot of Rob Alley's books deals with cases from Canada. Rusty Wilson has a whole Canadian book of stories from witnesses up there. So no, it's just as prevalent, if not more prevalent, up in Canada since there's so much space up there. It's less populated when you get away from the border area. So yeah, it's the same thing going on up there. I would probably think more of it, but less people to encounter it. Yeah. There are some Canadian researchers on YouTube and so forth, so if you do some research, you can find those. Anybody else? Do we have a hand up over there? No? Yeah.
Has fractal analysis been applied to the noise and sound that they make?
No, not that I know. That's a good idea.
Well, I was gonna say Tinker Funker has also analyzed digitally.
He's analyzed the sounds.
Yeah, and says that no human or animal can make that sound
Right.
because the way it goes up and it's
Of
consistent
course.
all the way across, and humans can't do
No,
that,
no, we can do.
and animals don't do it that way either.
If you've ever been to any Bigfoot days or any Bigfoot festivals and they have a Bigfoot howl contest, and anyone come up and see, and the best howl that any human can do doesn't even compare to the wild howl by a long shot. But I don't think we've done a fractal analysis of it. You'd look at it, dimension, but the Thinker Thunker, he has a good book, by the way, how to photograph and find Bigfoot, and basically says you can't, because they're always ahead of you, so you can't, that's why. But he has done a lot of the sound analysis, and you know, you kind of look at it graphically, and you can see that this is the way human voices sound, this is the way coyotes sound, this is the way wolves. And the bandwidth, the whole structure, the multiple octaves that the sounds come out of a Bigfoot in is not something that humans can do. So I think the sound evidence is pretty good. One more thing about the blurriness. It's not just the photos of Bigfoot are blurry. You've heard this criticism, why are all the photos? Even the best photos we have, like the Paul Freeman footage, it's not totally clear. Well, there are people that say that the Bigfoot looked blurry to their eyes. And again, this goes back into electromagnetics. We don't have to get into the details here, but the speed of light is calculated from something called permittivity, the electrical constant, and permeability, the magnetic constant. If those change, then the speed of light would change, it could oscillate. It would literally make something look blurry. And there are other examples in condensed matter physics in labs where things start to look blurry. I think there's some analogy there. So the reason they look blurry is because they are blurry, because the electromagnetic structure is varying a little bit, like the predator effect. So at least that's my interpretation of it. But yeah, go ahead.
So we have a family of 3 or 4 on our property.
Yeah.
And we felt the dense energy, and I thought it was knocking at me. A couple of years ago, every morning I would go and feed the ducks, and there would be one knock.
You got the woodlands.
How did they do that? So I was knocking on trees, and I couldn't get it to knock at it, and I think it was a click in their throat. And I didn't realize that they were talking to each other, and this was at the beginning of my research. And, so we've seen footprints and the pixelation on a tree.
You've seen the predator effect.
Yeah. And that they mind speak. They mind speak to me.
The mind speak, yeah. People that experience this mind speak sometimes go visit a psychologist because they think they're cracking up, but they're not. It's something that these life forms have the ability to project sounds into your mind.
They like fruit.
They like fruit.
They won't let it ripen. I
They
was
get
going to pick a whole tree of plums, and I was waiting for 3 days so it could get the sweetest as possible. They came one night and took
the whole tree.
The whole
fruit.
tree.
I've heard this before. Yeah, no, this sounds like that.
How do they do it? I mean, where,
I don't
how do they eat it all? Or
I don't-
do they carry it?
nobody knows.
I don't.
Let me just say one thing about the sounds. The wood knock sounds have been called wood knock sounds, but no one's actually seen them hitting trees. And there's some feeling they're making it, like you say, with their throat. It's a popping sound that they're making with their body in some way. It's not literally, I mean, when humans go out, and I've been out with some groups, and you go out with a stick and you start hitting the tree, I mean, we didn't get any response when I was out there. Did you get a response when you started hitting the tree or not?
No,
They don't do it that
but,
way.
you know, I think they know every time I go down into the forest, because we have this big gate that clangs. So it's like, oh, there she is, oh, yeah, she's up.
And it's very interesting. People have these relationships like you're mentioning, and they don't see them, but they hear them. They hear the signs. The fruit's gone. They see the footprints. It's really.
And a lot of the wood structures in our forest.
Oh, you have the wood structures. Have you seen any electromagnetic effects or any like things I mentioned, sound changes, quiet or anything like that?
Quiet.
Quiet.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. If you want to come up, we got.